Jim Lai has studied martial arts for most of his life. He holds a third-degree black belt from the World Taekwondo Federation, and he's fenced for nearly 25 years, starting with Olympic saber in high school. He received the title of Master of Defense in the Society for Creative Anachronism in 2015, where he discovered rapier combat in 1995. He moved to Chicago in 2002, and that introduced him to some of the early efforts to bring more historically accurate techniques to the SCA's rapier-focused combat sports. He started working with Timothy Lyon and Terry Tindill. Terry, you might know because he makes a lot of the fencing helmets that are out there. He does that guy's products. And these two actively document and promote historical combat arts in the SCA. Yeah, helmet just like that. They pointed him to work by Mary and I, and he's used some of our material to form sort of his understanding and foundation of his own work. I hope he's taken that into his own direction and his teaching. He continues to practice, compete, and teach primarily within the SCA's context, but he's branching out into the growing Western martial arts, historical European martial arts community, and all the different athletes in the Midwest of the United States. He's going to be speaking about training diestros for modern competitive fencing. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thanks, Doc. Well, I mean, to start with, the fact that I'm 6'2" and you and Mary are not did actually require me to do some interpretation pretty much right from the get-go. So I'm less of a scholar and more of I'm less of a scholar and more of a coach, and that's really kind of what I want to focus on today. So I mean, it is important to kind of to start.
And we're going.
All right. Well, sorry, Doug, not going to take a drink in time. One of the things that aside from being unable to do certain things that the Italianate systems were looking for due to just my own injuries, I found that there were principles of movement in Destreza that I found familiar to me from Taekwondo. If you look at this image on the left, the fighter in red is sliding to the right and launching an attack that constrains the fighter in blue's ability to land a valid counterattack because he's moving in an angle to basically to close off his opponent's ability to generate enough force to score. On the right, with the animation, if it is working for you, represents essentially a diagram that I've seen several across my years practicing Taekwondo that shows the angles with which you can attack. And the parallels between the two, basically, using positioning to create situational advantages, using movement to keep yourself safe, and attacking your opponent where you from positions of strength, where they're in a position of relative weakness, were pretty consistent in my head. And when I as I was getting more familiar with the techniques of Destreza, this is what really clicked in my mind. And so I decided that I'm going to commit to this. This is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to promote longevity as a fencer. So I said, great. Well, I know that Tybalt cancels out Caprofaro because I saw that movie. And I picked up the Academy of the Sword because it was one of the few translations that I was able to find that was available to me at the time. And it was a mistake, frankly. Lois, if you're on, if I knew now what you had taught in your lecture, I never would have bought it. because when I tried to read it, my eyes glazed over. I had no idea what it was saying. It was a very good translation. It's a very literal translation. But what it is not, it wasn't, to me at least, was not very functional. It did not explain to me how to actually fence. So Tim and Terry pointed me to Marion Puck's blog, some of the videos that Puck had been producing on YouTube, and then also eventually to their book that came out, and that is fundamentally what I use to develop my own learning, and also the material that I teach out of when I work with students. I personally need someone else who has that translator's mind to create a functional description of what the source material says. And then I can interpret it from there, and I can also help my students figure out how to make it work for them. And that's going to be one of the themes that I come back to a lot over the course of this presentation. There are a lot of things that are very similar that inform the way I fight with the sword, right? You know, all of these things. We good?
We got a bit of an echo going on. Can you try again?
Someone's not muted.
Yeah, 1 second. Let me hunt down the offender. Everyone is muted that I can see.
Okay. Seems to be fine now. Anyway, what I found was that in addition to certain physical similarities, mentally, the approach, the Destreza approach of being a small c conservative fencer who wants to establish a superior position of safety before doing something that would put me at risk, really fits in well with the way I approach. I approached combat, both when I was doing competitive taekwondo, and also sword-based combat sports. And the fact that there were these similarities just kind of gave me a bit of a head start in just learning the system. So when I teach and when I studied, I kind of worked from the ground up. Right, I first wanted to learn about how to move in this system. What you don't see here is you don't see a big diagram with a circle and a bunch of lines on it. Because I'm talking, like right now I'm talking about coaching, and that's really my focus is on competition. And so I wanted to try and distill the principles that those diagrams try to communicate into something that I can convey very, very quickly to someone who may not. Basically, this is someone who just doesn't have the same kind of a background. And the primary metaphor that I like to use is a video game controller. Back in the old days, when Puck and I were the young kids and had VCRs, you could move forward, backwards, left, and right, and then at a 45-degree angle to each one. And looks like that was pretty familiar to the way I had fenced before. Olympic fencing is very backwards and forwards. Occasionally, you can slide a little bit at an angle around on the strip, but it's not very wide. In the SCA, this gets you killed because people can walk over there. And so the metaphor that I try to use is an analog stick. The diestro needs to be able to move in any direction in any of 360 degrees at any point in time. And the way that they do this, the way that I teach people how to do this, is with these 5 principles that are here. The most important one being, don't let your knees touch. Because if they do, you immediately taken away your ability to move to move your circle in any of 360 degrees. If the animated GIF of the bear doing a hula hoop on the left is working, great. If it's not, it's a bear doing a hula hoop with a hula hoop. And this is the other.
Your animations are all working.
Right. Tim, if you can figure out how to add a bear to your warm-up, please let me know and also record it. But one of the things that I learned in Taekwondo, and I think that is translated very well to Destreza, is generating movement from your core, from your hips. When most people walk, we walk by falling, right? I'm going to start like we fall forward, then we catch ourselves. We fall and then we catch ourselves. Martial artists learn to generate movement from their core so that they can do something that's really important when you're fighting, that's less important when you're just walking from point A to point B, which is stopping in the middle because you perceive something that is a. And so if I am like falling from my shoulders or trying to use my legs and shoulders to drag my body around in a circle, this is going to make me slow, and this is going to make me slow, and it's going to constrain my ability to change directions and respond to things that my opponent feeds me. And if I'm not responding to that information, I'm wasting time. So if you think about generating power from your hips generate rotational energy, and that energy can translate into movement that is crisper, that is quicker, and that gets you through the kind of awkward intermediate stages that are between A and B in a way that is going to keep you safer. Then okay, so moving up, we started with the feet, we moved to the core, now we're looking at the arms. These are just these are pretty basic concepts of just how to hold a sword. The one that I want to focus on comes from a mistake that I made repeatedly when I first started learning the system, which was holding my hand too high. I used to stand, you stand here, and when I was starting out, I would try to use the top hand of my sword almost like a sight to aim down. And I kept getting stabbed under here, and I was like, what the heck is going on? And so, Tim and Terry, who had been disabusing me of the notion that I should hold my hand this high, said, well, I'm going to take a picture. I'm going to take a picture of you, and I'm going to show it to you, and you tell me what you tell me what you see. And what I saw was that I was basically holding my sword in front of my face and opening up my entire flank to a Fabris fencer who was just going to light me up all day long. And so what I try to work with my students on is trying to keep your arm roughly about shoulder height, and and when they're fighting someone who's taller than them, rather than lifting the hand, changing the angle. And as far as blade work goes, I mean,
Phil, before you go on, I think you found something really valuable there, and so many of the people on this in this lecture are people who teach in this art, and that's something that Eric and I see over and over again, is that desire to gun sight down the length of the blade from eye to tip, and it does exactly what you're describing. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, and I have a number of students that I work with. The SCA is more of a one-on-one teacher-student teacher-student model that actually works well for shifting into a coaching scenario. But all of my students are they're not as tall as I am. Right? Phil, who spoke a couple weeks ago, PJ and Kevin, who are on now, they're not 6'2", or they're not pushing 2 meters tall for the Europeans. And so when we were practicing, they would the arm would creep up, and that was one of the most important kind of practical tips, right? Is there's a way to deal with someone who's taller than you, and honestly, like the diagram in the center is a good explanation of it. If I need to get taller, I don't have to lift my whole arm. I just need to create a new line. In this case, it's from B to G. And as far as blade work goes, I mean, I start from the position that people know how to stab. People generally know how to cut. We go through this relatively quickly, and then I spend a lot of time on the attack. I personally believe that a diestro uses the atajo both to defend themselves and to create situations that enable them to attack safely. Going back to what I said before, being kind of a conservative system, I want to make sure that I am safer than my opponent. What does safer mean, right? That means that my opponent has to do more things, right, take more action to hit me than I do to hit them. And the atajo is a consistent way of creating that situation, so that focusing on that really keeps the fencer focused on first establishing their own superior position of safety. And so we talk about how to get the atajo. I mostly teach, I teach it out of from the page to practice, which are primarily the Pacheco method of doing it. We do occasionally look at the placing the atajo from below, and I'll get to that in a minute. We look at ways to avoid the atajo, right? And I try to break that into two scenarios that are dependent on what you as an athlete are able to perceive. If you perceive that someone is attempting to place a tahoe on you early, the things that you can do to avoid that and reestablish your own atajo is going to be a different set of options than you will have available to you if, let's say, they place the atajo, you're going to execute the atajo successfully, and they have gotten to that point. Right? They have created a cross, they're on top, they're stronger. They've ticked off all of those boxes. And so we really focus a lot on the atajo, defenses against the atajo, and counters to those defenses.
So I have a question about this before you go on.
Sure.
You're fencing primarily within the SCA context, and you're talking about cuts. That leaves us this sort of problem within the SCA's basic rapier game about the way that cuts are formed. Usually they have to be two discrete tempos now instead of a single tempo. How do you address that? Are you fencing primarily in the side sword arena, or are you going right into the rapier arena with this too?
I do it by changing my equipment. So last week, Doug talked about a form of fencing called cut and thrust, which is more similar to what we would do in HEMA, where we're placing percussive cuts. And for that, when I'm fighting there, and when I'm fighting people who are doing more cut-based systems, I tend to use this. This is a 38-inch. It's a 38-inch blade on a fairly simple. When I'm fighting in rapier, I just change my gear. And Pacheco can make fun of me, and he can spin in his grave, and I don't care, because this is a 45-inch rapier. It comes up right. It comes. The Keon pokes me in the belly button, so Tindill will save your grave. But ultimately, what I do is when I'm fighting rapier, I switch to the longer blade, and when I'm, where I would be cutting attacks with the 38 to someone's body, instead I will use the cuts. I will make cuts, and if I have to make them, I will make them to the blade first and turn that into a thrust. So, a lot of times it turns into a cut to the blade and then a gliding thrust, or a cut as like an expulsion of the blade, and then a thrust, a thrust essentially to three.
Thanks. That answers my question.
So that's the teaching. That's the learning. That's the teaching. And now I want to kind of talk about the difference between teaching and coaching. This is very important to when you're planning for a tournament. Teaching is it's about me, the instructor, and what I know, conveying information and knowledge to a student that the student does not necessarily have. Right? We're either learning a new technique, or we're finding, we're tinkering with something, we're correcting errors. We are trying to make, we're trying to build on a foundation. By the time you're getting ready for a tournament, the teaching part needs to stop. If you can think back to when you were in college or university, you've ever had to cram for an exam. I know that for me, cramming was basically useless. When it came down to the night before a test, I either knew it or I didn't, and no amount of trying to force feed myself information was going to help. If nothing else, it would actually confuse me more, because I would get all tied up in my head and trying to remember what I was supposed to do. When you are fencing, and you have a very, very small amount of time to perceive what your opponent is doing, select the appropriate action on your part, and then defend yourself and then strike them. The bigger your decision tree is, the more options you have, the slower your mind will work, and the more quickly you get there. And so coaching is about meeting the athlete where they are, and taking what they know and helping them refine that so that they can make decisions as efficiently as possible when it comes down to a real-time situation where they, half of the scenario is completely outside of their. And so what are some things that we need to do? First, we need to recognize that every fencer is different. Unlike the manuals, we are not clones of each other, right? When I fence, if I line up opposite Puck, my ranges are going to be completely different from his. My steps will lead to different results than his do, because I am put together differently than he is. And so the first thing you want to do is you want to understand your fencer's, your athlete's body type, and you want to understand what they're capable of. And this is in addition to just right height, age, weight, and so on. This can be things like history of injuries. I have of the three students that I work with that are most active. One of them is he's young, he's fit, he's energetic. One of them is older, not as athletic, and has also sustained a couple injuries that make explosive, fast movements painful. And honestly, this is supposed to be fun. And if something is hurting your athlete, don't make them do it. Especially if it's aggravating an injury. My third student, who's sort of in between in terms of their body type and sort of their approach to combat, has some chronic injuries as well that make it difficult for them to, for example, hold the sword in a way that I teach. Right, I typically teach, plugging your shoulder into the socket, engaging your lats, hanging the sword off of these big muscles that run down your back, and using your little precise rotator cuff to mostly help steer and aim. This doesn't necessarily work for them because of their history, and so they talk about engaging their core to help support their upper body, and that works for them. And so we need, the first thing you want to do as a coach is come to an understanding about what physically your fighter can and is comfortable doing. I don't want to you don't want to hurt them. You don't want to turn them off. You want to meet them where they are, and you want to make them the most effective diestro that they can be, not necessarily a little clone of yourself. In addition to the physicality, I want to look. You want to look at mentally and emotionally how they approach combat. I talked about hot fighters and cool fighters. This is more like this is the temperament, right? I am a hot fighter. I'm a bully. I am going to I'm going to stalk up to you real hard. I'm going to put an Tahoe on you. I'm going to push you around, and I'm going to stab you. And I'm very upfront about that, right? I do this. This is the same thing I do with everyone, but it works. I practice it a lot. Just the way that I hot fighter. One of my students is a hot fighter. He doesn't do it the same way. He's more, right? He's smaller. He's faster, and so he is moving. So he's moving differently, but he's still basically bringing a high energy, high intensity fight. The students is a cool fighter. What I mean there's, they're going to hang back. They're going to, they're going to maintain the right angle. They're going to keep a defensive position. They're going to move around, and they're going to use positioning to make their opponent, to encourage their opponents to try to attack them in a way that is suboptimal, so that they have an easier time placing the Tahoe. And once they get the Tahoe, then they'll work their way in gradually, keeping themselves safe until they get to a point where they see that it is safe to strike. And if it takes them like 3, 4, 5 minutes, that's totally fine. My third student that I work with a lot is kind of in between. They are, they work with their hands, and so they've got arm and shoulder strength, but then they have some injuries, which kind of counterbalances that. So sometimes they can fight hot, sometimes they fight cool, and sometimes they fight sort of in between. They're actually, of the four of us, the best at lying to their opponent, and maybe placing what feels like a bad Tahoe, except that they know that they're placing a bad Tahoe, so that when you fire when you fire your gliding thrust and try to put it up, fire it up the sword, you end up eating it in the head, and that's pretty great. I need to sum it up. Basically, I mean, these are not action figures, right? We do not want fencing robots. As a coach, put your ego, put your own philosophy, your own personal fight aside, and look at how the skills that you've given your athletes fit into fit their body, fit their mind, and make them the best gesturer they can.
Jim, I think you're on another interesting topic there. Carranza, he breaks students down into 4 humors, each one associated with an element. Send me an email later, remind me, and I'll send you some of that information. I think
that'd be great.
The framework that you're describing there kind of lines up with that idea.
So yeah.
Actually, Jim, can you, if we go back to the previous slide, what you're talking about, helping each of your students like fence appropriately for themselves, for their own methods. Could you give some examples of things that like certain techniques, certain methods, or whatever that actually come from our Destreza school that might vary from one type of student to another?
Sure. So, right, we talked about, I don't have quite enough camera width, so I'm going to use a wooden stick. This is just right. So, I talked about differences in height, right? And so we fight Destreza. We like to hang out in the right angle. We think this is a really nice, strong defensive position. Well, if I'm a foot taller than my opponent, if I walk out here like this, they're just going to literally walk under my arm and hit me, first of all. And for them, they're not actually, for them, the shorter fencer, they're also not defending themselves. I'm just going to do it for them. So we both have to make an adjustment. And for the shorter fencer, we talked before, we don't want to do this, right? I don't want to aim down I'm not Pinocchio. I'm not stabbing with my nose. So instead, we did that. So instead, I work with my shorter fencers to do this. This is not specifically the right, if you look at 2 people on a drawing, this isn't the right angle. However, when they're facing a taller opponent, what I'm going to do, because what I'm going to do is I may place my right angle here. And so the angles, when the swords come up to each other, if we both step together, turns out my downward angle and her, and their upward angle will end up in a similar alignment to what you would get if you had 2 clones of each other with their arms at shoulder height in your right angle. That's an example of a practical application that preserves the purpose of the technique, but adapts it to the reality of the situation that the 2 fighters are in right here and right now. That help?
Yeah, I was just curious about some exactly this sort of thing, right? If there's some other ways that you take the theory and adjust it away from the norm that we normally see addressed in the books to adapt it to be appropriate for your particular fencer.
We have a question from the audience that follows this line of reasoning as well. Do you encourage shorter fencers to fight hotter and engage more since they have to cross that distance?
Depends who they are. So, like someone who's athletic and fast, absolutely. You slip basically once you slip past their point, you get your Tahoe, keep it, and you can they can run you around all day long. But not everyone has that level of athleticism. Right? One of my students has a history of knee injury, and so what you're describing, fighting hot, really isn't going to work for very long. And the more I push them to do it, the more likely they are to injure themselves and have to take a lot of time out, and that helps nobody. And so height is only part of it, right? It's height, it's athleticism, it's everything. And so for that student, really, what we focus on is maintaining a strong defense, maintaining kind of good situational awareness, and being able to respond quickly to information they gather from their opponent, whether it's them defending themselves in the Tahoe and using that to start to attack, or or something else.
So do you think a Tahoe and right angle, would you sort those into different categories depending on the height of the fencer who uses them?
I mean, like the way I teach a Tahoe is it's almost it's a checklist. If you can produce these outcomes, cross the swords, you're on top, you're closer to your strength, your point across is stronger than theirs. At the end of the day, how will they get there? If they're able to produce those outcomes, they will be able to put their opponent in a situation where the opponent has to do more things to hit them than they do, and that makes them inherently faster. So I'm really, I'm looking at this as, can you within the bounds of the system create the scenario that the plates and that the text is describing. And so, like, for the short, for the shorter person, right, for the shorter fencer, if this is where my blade starts, this actually turns out to help create the Tahoe, because as they step in, and as they move, as they move into my arm with their entire body, right, the blade, eventually you will shift from pushing laterally to just being over the top, just because the blade's at an angle already. And as they step, the opponent's blade will eventually slide down into their hilt, or they will disengage, and which point you just push it out. Okay. And so what I do is I kind of work with the student to figure out what's the right way for them to get that Tahoe in the context of who their opponent is. Just like when two people are the same height, this is fine, right? If they happen to be, if sometimes they happen to be the taller fighter, okay, well then we will make that adjustment. At the end of the day, I'm still for the Tahoe, I'm still using the characteristics of the Tahoe that the book describes. And just how we get there may vary somewhat from person to person and opponent to opponent. As for the right angle, I want to make sure, I view it as a nice neutral guard. It keeps me free. I can move my arm however I want to. I can defend any line relatively easily, and it doesn't give away anything to my opponent. I can move and attack and set up an offense in any direction that I want to move. And so, if my right angle happens to be here because I'm fighting someone who's 6'8", then that's where it's going to be. That's fine. If I'm fighting someone who's 5 feet tall, my right angle is going to be a little different. Because I want to be able to use, because I want to make sure that they have the point of my sword within their field of view, reminding them that they can't just run up to me and try to hit me. They have to deal with the fact that I am armed and I am pointing at them.
So you've generated a lot of engagement with this particular topic. I have one more from the audience.
Sure.
Can you describe what would be the type of fencer that you would teach counterpunching to? Define counterpunching however you like.
That's usually what I describe as a cool fighter, right? Someone who is going to someone who's going to defend themselves against your attacks and then punish you for them. And there are really two ways that I teach. I try to teach sort of a defensive fight and coach someone to work on that. One is to simply just use your movement, use your footwork to produce and to get yourself into a position that we're going to look at in the next slide, but basically where I have more range of motion with my sword than they do. So see what else I have in here. Okay. I've got one fencer, who's Judy Hopps, and I've got this other fencer here, right? They're sort of vaguely in profile standing each other. If my fence, right, so they have an arm sticking forward. Different systems we'll talk about a cone of defense, right, which is roughly the shape, essentially the movement that the position that my arm can generate without hyperextending or collapsing the joint. And so what we try to do with the pull fencers is we try to create a situation where they're not face to face, but they're more here. I'm going to move them into use their footwork to move themselves into a position where they have my person has their entire range of motion, and the other person, because they're at like a weird angle, has to defend themselves kind of like this, or perhaps over like that. And what that does is it gives my fencer more options as it takes their options away. That explain it?
I think so.
Okay, great. So yeah, we want to, and so yeah, this is kind of what I was about to get. If anyone has never seen it, Rock'em Sock'em Robots is a little kids game. They've got these two little plastic guys here inside of a little boxing ring, and players have these two levers, and the levers can move the boxers back and forth a little bit, and then they can punch. That's what you do. You try to land a punch to the chin that pops the head up, and we don't want that. Like there's a lot of bad rapier fencing, where people will kind of they come into range, they plant, they fire, they attack, they parry, and eventually someone gets hit. And that's not what we want to do. That's how you blow your elbows out, right? And that's also how you gank the hell out of your opponent. If you're slinging as hard and fast as you can, and you end up blasting them, and then you hurt your opponent, and we don't want to do that. Instead, we're trying to create a situation that is similar in theory, if not in appearance, to essentially principles of naval combat, from back in the day when ships had all their guns on the side, right? If I have a fleet and all of my cannons are on the side, the best place for me to be is broadside to nose of my opponent, of my enemy. This is fundamentally what we're trying to do with our football. We're trying to create a situation where I have more offensive options than my opponent does, so that I am placing them under threat without really even having to do anything with my arms yet at all. And the way we do that is with footwork. Right? We use the principles of motion that I talked about before. We don't let our knees touch so that we can move in any direction. We use our hips to generate rotational energy to help us move quickly and precisely. And we use that in combination with our tajos and with our right angle and their variations, to create a situation where essentially I have more guns pointed at my opponent than they have pointed at me. And that's how. So like that's the footwork. And then we talk about the tajo, right? The one thing, the worst possible thing you can have in a fencing bout, in my opinion, is a double kill or a double hit or a blow after blow, whatever you call it. Basically, two people are bleeding now, and that's you want to survive the fight, right? If you don't survive it, it doesn't really matter what you did to your opponent, because you're not going to enjoy it. And the answer to that is with the tajo, so that we will use our footwork to create the situations that make the tajo maximally effective, because I'm trying to my goal is for my fencers to place the tajo in a situation where their opponent is already feeling constrained just by the relative positioning of their bodies. And that makes placing the tajo easier, because you have less to think about. It becomes relatively easy to tell which line is going to be the easiest one to place it on, and that will also give you a lot of useful information about where the opponent is able to go. Because if I'm standing facing straight ahead and my opponent is coming at me from here, placing a tajo this way, this gives them a lot of information about the options that I have in order to escape from this terrible situation and potentially try to attack. So that's the plan. And we're going to take that and we're going to use that to build, we're going to use that to sort of document this strategy. You don't want to live in the danger zone. Unfortunately, in most cases, if you can hit your opponent, they can probably also hit you. It may not necessarily be, a chest to chest or, a killing blow to killing blow, but we are not all, I mean, even the tallest of us and the shortest of us, we're still human beings. It's not like I can, I can have that much more reach than someone that I basically never have to worry about. And so I want to use my defensive strategy is going to come into play first. And yes, I can be a big giant bully and still worry about defense. It actually makes it easier for me to be a bully because I don't have to worry about, parrying as much or, worrying about those kinds of things because I have created a situation where it's easier for me to predict what they're going to do. And typically, so I mean, really, this is all about combining movement with the Tahoe to create situations where you have more and where you have asymmetrical information. You know more about what your opponent can do than they know about what you can do. And it's footwork, a Tahoe, and then finally the other Spanish word that I like to use is tacto. It's really those three things that create your defense and protect you. Footwork constrains their options. A Tahoe further takes away their choices, particularly their good ones. And then tacto is what you use to inform yourself how they're responding. And the reason I focus very strongly on tacto, even though I fight a lot of Italian fencers who hate touching swords, is that, and I don't have the citations to the neuroscience behind this, but if I don't need to use my eyes to process information, I can respond quicker. So if I can respond to something based entirely on what it feels like, I don't have to wait and see like which way is their sword going. I can feel it, and I can feel what they're doing and predict what their response is likely to be based on the information I got through tacto. And I can use my eyes for other things, like whether they are going to bring their other hand into play, do something strange. But like the fundamentals of knowing where their sword are, it happens to be, and where it's going to go in response to my attack. The less I can involve my eyes, the better it's going to be. And between among these three things, I'm going to create a situation where I know more about the fight than my opponent, and I can and the people that I coach will know more about the fight than I don't know if you remember this, Bob, but this is one of yours.
Yeah, that's one of mine.
On the offense, this is actually really effective. This is like really good, right? Fundamentally, what's your goal, right? I want to put the point into the other guy without the same thing happening to me, and so I am going to use my superior positioning that I gained through football. I'm going to put a Tahoe on there to know where they're to constrain where they're capable of going, and I'm going to use I'm going to feel for what they're likely to do and respond accordingly. And so if you look at this, the goal here is to make a really, really small decision tree that has a lot of data up front and a small number of effective responses, so that the thing that I don't have to do is run down through an extensive decision making. If anyone's ever been in the military, there's this concept that I've heard from my friends who are veterans called the OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. The party who can get through those 4 steps faster wins. And so the less work you can make yourself do on the observing and orienting side of things, faster you're going to get to be able to decide and act. And this is this offensive strategy development is where some students are able to figure out how to lie to their opponent. It's not like, I don't find Destreza to be a very effective feinting style. It's like, all right, I'm here. You know where my, this is my reach. I can't really go very much further than that. So like a feint, it's more likely to get me stabbed because it's going to be fairly slow motion. I have to move my entire body to convince them that I'm going to try and stab them. However, and this is something that I learned from one of my students, if I make what looks like a bad atado that, I don't know, maybe puts the weak of my sword down, closer to the strong of theirs, or if I make a silly kind of attack near their hand or something, ordinarily good fencers will know and perceive that this is an opportunity to hit you. And if you're staying a step ahead of them because you've used your footwork, and you've used your positioning to know where the most dangerous lines of counterattack are, you can give that to them because you've already told yourself how you're going to defend. You already know how you're going to defend against the counterattack because you've taken away their ability to attack you from multiple different lines. There's only going to be one or two where you can make a couple of quick movements, defend yourself with a better, reestablish a good attack, the actual Tahoe, and then that's generally how I've been able to work with my students to effectively deceive their opponent, deceive opponents using this. So like I said before, fencing is not like it shows in the movie, right? We're not clones of each other. We're not always doing the same thing. Right? People in this community come from a variety of traditions, from systems that come from all around the world. So in addition to those physical differences that we talked about, in addition to the mental differences, we have to adapt what we want to do to the fighting system that we're facing. And the most important thing that I look for here, and that I coach students to look for, I say, where is their opponent's sword actually? Here's what I mean by that. So, at the stick, right? I'm in the right angle. This is how far I can reach. If I want to reach any further, I need to do something weird, like kind of hyperextend my shoulder or step. But fundamentally, this is as far as I'm going to go. Not everyone fights this way. It turns out there's a lot of people who fight back-weighted, right? They're really far away from you. They're hiding their face, right? Or if they're fabrics, they're bending over and they're shielding their torso by withdrawing. And what that does is it takes their center of gravity. It takes their center of gravity. If this is a person, and moves it. And when they move it, they are lying to you. And I learned this the hard way. My Italian fencer opponents would line up and they do a nice kind of guard. Here's their sword, and I'm going to walk up and I'm going to put, point to hilt, point to hilt, and oh look, I'm dead. And it's not just I'm dead. I am dead before I was able to even perceive that they had done anything. And the reason is, an Italian style fencer, or any kind of back-weighted fencer really, is a lot closer to you than their on-guard position would suggest. And what I mean by that is, if I'm leaned back here, right, where I can actually move a lot farther just by shifting my weight forward. And so my hand ultimately ends up leaving the frame, but without moving their feet at all, someone who has a better back and better knees is able to reach further than we can just kind of standing up here. And we need to adapt to that. And the way that I coach people to adapt to that, to fighting systems, is to start the fight from further away. And this is one of my rapier simulators. We tip our swords. We don't want to hurt people. And in the SCA, you're required to fix the tip to the blade with some contrasting tape, so that it doesn't come off. We don't want anyone to get hit with a bare blade. That sucks. But the other thing so in addition to being a nice piece of safety equipment, that tape is a nice indicator for a competitor when they see someone who is not fencing the same way they are, to gauge where they can begin placing their tahoe. And the general rule of thumb that I use, whenever I'm fighting someone that I'm not familiar with, is to place my tahoe right there, right at the end of the tape. This gives me the maximum amount of space and thus time between my guts and their sword to see how they're going to respond. And this, I know some folks have said that like the general techniques are hard to use in combat, or some folks have, other people said they don't work. I tend to disagree, and here's why. I don't treat them as I don't interpret them as a constant series of actions on your part, right? You're not pushing, making a full circle, coming back and hitting. What you're doing, I believe, is using these as a quick muscle memory, pre-programmed way to regain an tahoe when someone tries to escape from it in a very common way. So you've got the two generals that involve full circles, right? You've ever seen an Italian fencers try to gain a sword? They're spinning their swords around each other a lot. And if you try and gain a sword in the Italian system from far away, and so it's kind of like it's week over week. Someone disengages, the typical response is to disengage around their disengage in a full circle, put it back on top, and stab them. So it's pretty familiar. And by structuring the generals as essentially ways to regain your tahoe when someone tries to escape from you, I find they become very effective. Both the full circle, both the two that create a full circle and the two that end up in a half circle, right, where your sword kind of ends up underneath. And this is and that's a situation where I do steal the tahoes from below from Rada, because ultimately, like, yeah, I can move this with my blade, but if I happen to be able to pick up their sword with this giant hook here that's on the top of mine, that's just like a get out of danger free card. Once that thing's locked in, you just go hit it.
I have a question for you, because I was thinking the same thing. First, there's some positive response to your understanding of the generals from the audience. And I think that using it to capture a sword that is escaping is pretty common. And I was also thinking about Rada in the terms that you're describing. Do you think Rada, you were also a Pachikista, one of the few, right? We've had so many Rada boys here, like talking the Rada smack. Do you think Rada was an idiot for creating the tahoes below instead of calling those generals like any sensible diestro would write that out? Go ahead and put that on the record now.
I personally just call them all atahos and we skip them. Like I said, I am primarily a coach of competitors, so I don't care. So that's like, I'm gonna offend everyone right off the bat, right? Y'all call it whatever you want. I'm gonna look at it. I'm gonna look at the outcome you're trying to produce. And I'm gonna try and adapt that in a way that is consistent with my own physical abilities and the physical abilities of the people that I'm working with. At the end of the day, like I said, I can call it an tahoe, I can call it a general, whatever. They are ways of making me momentarily safer than my opponent so that I can do it. It's really all they are. But when you are training someone to enter competition where they are going to be facing a bunch of mixed systems, non-systems, completely different types of weapons, the most important thing that I found is that we need time, and thus we need space to perceive and interpret what the opponent is doing or what the opponent is trying to do. And that's that space and time gives us the ability to more effectively incorporate that data into our method and figure out what's the best way to place that atajo. We will, because I do a lot of fencing with non-diestros. I use virtual atajos a lot too. There's a whole bunch of people who fight with rapier way down here, way down here. They got a dagger way up here, look kind of like the Neapolitans, and their name is Rob Childs and his students. And they're a lot of fun to fight when you can actually pin them down. But it's a really great example of how to make a virtual atajo in a way that allows me to constrain the blade, but also produces tactile. And here's something that you obviously are not going. I'm obviously not going to reach all the way down onto the floor to try and physically place my sword against theirs. But because I know that because I know that our arms and legs can only move in so many different kinds of ways, I know that in order for someone to hit me with a sword, if their arm is here, it has to come up. And it can only come up in one of three ways: forwards, right, left. Well, stuff in between. But fundamentally, I can play fundamentally by placing a virtual atajo and constraining the immediate forward. What I like to do with people who refuse their guards, by the way, is I like to point my sword right at the cup of their elbow, so that if they raise their hand, they stab themselves. And that just encourages them to do this or this, and that is slow. And when something is slow, that means it's easier to place an atajo on. And as this sword is coming up this way or coming up this way, that's all the information you need. Place your tajo and go. I saw someone in the chat saying, have I managed to beat him? Rob? Not in tournament, because the man is a tournament. He's one of the best fighters I've ever met. And I can hold my own if we're fighting with just a single rapier, but I'm not really a good rapier and dagger fighter. So if we're picking up secondary weapons, he's probably going to smoke me because he just trains harder. He trains harder and longer and better than anyone else I know.
Thankfully, we've got Lois, who's put out all the dagger work, so that works out there. So get busy.
Yep, that's something else I need to pick up. Okay, so I want to finish by going through a few drills that I use in order to help develop skills and train muscle memory, situational awareness, and tactics. The basic one I use, I think this is one I got from Kevin Markoshi, actually. This is something. It's a clock drill, right? The instructor stands in the middle and gets hit a lot, right? The student will place a series, will place atajos as they move around with transfer steps. The instructor will respond in various ways, right? Parry, disengage, stand there like a dope. Basically anything you want to teach, and the student's job is to respond. So, right? I respond to a parry with a disengage underneath. Responds to a disengage by, regaining the atajo and a strike. Fairly simple. And they go around, right? You go around the clock one way, you go around the clock the other way, and you change roles. All of my drills involve the instructor getting hit a lot. Part of that is just because, as a coach, I really do believe that it is my job to make it really all about my student. And one of the easiest ways I find to put a student into that mindset where it's about them and they're invested and they're enthusiastic is to do things where I'm the one who gets hit. And that's just it's a way for me to that I can effectively build rapport with the student. The second drill that I use a lot of is stimulated battle. There are two versions of this. One where the student will place atajos on the instructor. The instructor's job is to get out. They can disengage, go back to the right angle, retreat, parry, whatever they're going to do. And this just keeps moving on and moving and moving as the student is able to work their footwork. The instructor can observe that, and kind of give tips and corrections about how to land, how to move. But ultimately, the goal is for the students to get to a situation where they think that they have an effective killing attack. The command that we use there is freeze. I don't want to use hold or halt because that means stop fencing. And in the ESA particularly, when we hear that, we stand up, we put our weapons down, and we look around and make sure it's okay. I need to maintain relative position, so I use a different command. We just freeze. Everyone stops moving, but they try to stay where they are, or they kind of correct back to it, and then the student tries to execute their attack. The instructor's job is either to just to stop it somehow, either by defending, or by attacking into it and doubling out. Because hey, if you die, you fail. If the student is successful, reset, and if they fail, one of the reasons that we do this with at first with only the student acting is they can back it up and we can look at it. We can go back to the situation that we had when we first called freeze and look at, hey, what made you think that this was the right time to try and hit me? And then B, if it failed, well, what are some things that we can do in order to make it more effective? Sometimes the answer is going to be, oh, I just didn't, I thought I saw something that wasn't there. More often than not, I think that by the time my students might get to this drill, they've seen it, they just didn't quite get it entirely correct, and so we can fix that. And that's how we build muscle memory. This is how we analyze the student's technique and analyze an athlete's game, and make those tweaks in a scenario that is more consistent with what they're going to do in competition than sort of a static drill or lesson. And the second part, the second sort of version of this is where both partners are trying to gain a Tahoe. Right now, we're just fencing. Right, I'm trying to gain a Tahoe. They're trying to gain a Tahoe. Everyone is going back and forth, trying to gain that superior position. The only difference, of course, is that when it's time to attack someone, you call freeze first, and then so that you can evaluate. And finally, this is my tactile. It is being able to know where someone's sword is going without having to look for it makes you faster. And so what we do is we start in the right angle. The student closes their eyes, and the student will close their eyes and place the Tahoe. And the instructor, when you start out, you'll let them because someone isn't actually looking at you, and this can be fairly dangerous. I do recommend the instructor wear a helmet, but the instructor will respond. They can they can carry the blade, they can disengage whatever they're going to do, and the student's job is to regain the Tahoe without opening the eyes. So, if I'm here, I set that place. As I'm attempting to place a Tahoe, if I'm the student, the instructor just if I make contact with the blade, and as I'm moving, I feel the instructor disengage. I know at this point exactly where he has to be, which it's right over here. And so when we get good at this drill, we'll actually, the way we start is at least I'm on the right side of my body, right? Because this is weird. We don't normally fight blind. But as we practice this, what I've observed is that it does in fact get tighter as people develop a better sense of tactile. So that by the time that we've been doing this for several months, we've gotten a good feel for it. My students have actually been able to do the entire thing blind. Right? We come to guard, we know where we are. They close their eyes, they execute the Tahoe, they pick up another Tahoe, and then they hit me, and they haven't opened their eyes at all. And I think this is the most awesome thing ever. But yeah, so those are the three drills that I use. They help us practice. They help us practice footwork. They help us practice creating, controlling space and creating positional advantages. They help us practice a Tahoe and how to escape it, how to regain it in a fluid, non-cooperative situation that nevertheless remain focused on establishing a position of superior safety before we attack. And then finally, and they help us learn tactile, which is the thing that the thing that we do in order to start depending on less information when we fight. And as we put these all together, we start to develop tacto without necessarily establishing from the very beginning. This is really, so this kind of goes back to strategies to use to fight people that use their sword. Right? I don't actually need to always have contact in order to have tacto. I can use virtual atajos and positioning to predict where the opponent's sword is going to be, if it's going to threaten me at all. And I can place my sword, and I can place my virtual atajo in a fashion that will intercept the most likely line that my opponent is going to move to when they have to, when they bring their sword into presence. And thus, essentially, they will give me tacto without me actually having to go hunt for it. This is kind of the thing that it's like we're all trying to get there. We occasionally get it. We are occasionally successful, and when we are, it's awesome. And sometimes it fails, but we are all students on the same journey. And the fact that I may have started mine a little sooner than the people that I am teaching doesn't mean that we're not all constantly learning. And these drills really help to reinforce that, because we're all doing the same. So that's my presentation. If you have any questions, I'm happy to respond. I think we're probably all on the Facebook group and all on Discord. If you want to email me later. I'm happy to take any other questions.
All right, I have a couple of questions that popped up in the chat.
Okay.
Earlier in the presentation, you talked about moving from the hips rather than like falling steps. What are some drills that you would recommend that develop moving from the hips?
I learned it using a hula hoop, but you don't need to. Ultimately, the easiest way that I found to do this is to start by practicing walking straight backwards and forwards. And you'll know that you've succeeded when you can. So, like, if I'm going to fall from the shoulders, I have to move my foot, or I'm going to fall on my face. If I'm moving from my, if I'm generating power from my core, if I move from my hips, I can stop. Right? I can be moving, and I can stop at any point in time through my pace, and either change my mind, go somewhere else, back up, do a lot of different things. And unfortunately, you didn't see that. Like, from here, when I stop here, my right foot is off the floor. So, but I haven't fallen forward because I'm basically pulling myself forward from my core. So that's the way that I use, the way I start teaching that. And then from there, a lot of it really depends on who the student is. I have one student who is a Middle Eastern dancer. They're a belly dancer. They actually already know how to do this, and they do it better than I do because they do it all the time, and they do it. They practice. It was just for them. It was just a matter of translating. I have another student who was an equestrian, and you wouldn't think that people who ride horses would use their hips, but they actually do. And she's not a diestro. However, learning to change directions in her footwork from her core was very effective. Was super effective for her as well. And then finally, for other folks, I know someone who was a boxer, and they know this as well, right? When you're boxing, if you want to generate power, you start from the hip first. That gets your shoulder moving, and that gets the arm out. This can be translated. Can be translated into movement. And so, really, like the most important thing is to basically get your hips, get your core loose. Don't be able to turn your hips like back and forth like this, and you'll start to be able to develop that essentially separation. And yes, I'm reading that. Yeah, I've been reading Lois's belt drill. When I was starting out in Taekwondo, they did actually that to teach you. They grabbed you by the belt and they pulled you. And your core would jerk forward and then you would move. And as you practice that, you learn to do that yourself. The most fun way I found to practice this is partner dancing, swing dancing, tango ballroom dancing, anything like that. Because if you don't develop that skill, you can't do the turning steps as quickly and as precisely, and it's just not as much fun. But doing that with a partner, is a lot of fun. And Destreza does get compared to dancing a lot because both diestros and dancers are moving around the floor, in 360 degrees of movement with someone else in front of them. We're just not holding on to the diestros are just not holding on to our partners. We're sort of using our swords instead to get them in position.
All right, I have a couple more questions here.
Sure.
So do you find that you apply your technique more in the before, the during, or the after? And I'm just going to dovetail on that with my own question. I'd like to hear some stories about, so you're using the Pachachista side of the tradition, a little bit of the earlier school. So first question, what tempo, what timing do you find yourself in when you're applying technique? And what has your experience been as far as your effectiveness with this tradition fighting in the SCA?
Sure. I personally am typically fighting from the. I'm a bully. I don't care what my opponent is doing. I am going to come up. I'm gonna roll up to them, and I'm going to put my sword on theirs, and I'm going to seize the advantage. And it's basically it's going to be my turn. It's going to be my turn. It's going to be my turn, and then they're going to be dead, or they're going to escape, and then in which case I'm going to reset, and it's going to be my turn. I also practice with a Meyerist, and that meshes real well. A cooler fencer is going to fight more in the during and after, right? They want to see what they want you to bring it to them. They want you to present your plan so that they can pick it apart. So if I'm fighting if I'm fighting in the during, I'm here in my guard. If I'm fighting an Italian fencer, they're going to come if they're going to come and attempt to gain my blade, I'm going to as they are passing from where they are out of their own range, so they're at their defensive measure. As they're entering their offensive measure where they can strike me, as they're sort of passing through that transitional period, that's when I want to make my time. Right? They've committed to an offensive action that's not yet trying to hit me, but they haven't finished it yet, and so they're in the middle of this thing. Their foot's off the ground. They're moving forward. They've got to land, and they can't do anything until they do. That's a perfect time. And then sometimes, if I'm fighting cool, I will also end up fighting in the after. As I am responding to things that they're doing, the key here for fighting in the after is to do that when you have better positioning on the floor, right? Because if I'm just squared up with someone, right, we're right in front of each other, we're both in our guards, and I wait for them to lunge at. If I wait for them to lunge at me before I do something, it's not going to work as well because they have all of their options. That lunge might be a feint. I don't actually know. So however, if I have changed the angle somewhat, so that my opponent doesn't have their full range of options, it's easier for me to fight in the after because the number of things that you can do, the number of things that they can do to me to try and make me chase them, basically, is a lot smaller. Phil, I saw Phil mentioned something about conclusions. I don't do a lot of movements of conclusion. First of all, because within the SCA, grabbing your opponent, it's not really within most of the rule set. In some areas, we are developing that. Right, we're developing, including grappling techniques into the fight. And where we have done that, what we've learned is that most of the grappling happens at the sword because, hey, swords are really effective And why would I want to run up and grab you when I can just poke you with it? And so in those situations, the movements of conclusion do work pretty well. And they do work pretty well, and they do work sort of the way I use them, the way I teach them, is there's something you use when your opponent is in the middle of attacking, is in the middle of attacking. So I use them in the after. That's typically a response that I have to someone who has successfully placed an Tahoe on me and is attempting to hit me. Or if they're a different kind of fencer, they may have they may have placed stringera on my blade and they're going to lunge. Something basically they have seized what they believe to be control and they're about to do something bad. And then I'm going to do then I'm going to I'm going to do this conclusion or this conclusion, whichever one it is, because they have committed to trying to hit me to trying to hit me. They can't change their mind anymore. And as long as I have top toe, I know which way they're going to hit me from and can choose the right conclusion because there's only one option.
So I oftentimes, I'm not sure if Eric would commit to this or not, but oftentimes I tell people to go for the strong of the sword. But generally I prefer the wrist. Inside the SCA, I think going for the strong of the sword is acceptable. Is fleeting contact to the back of the arm okay? Like an open-handed check to the arm, acceptable in your area?
Yeah, and it's going to be cultural. The rule is that I can make intentional fleeting contact with my opponent's body. Presently, the way we interpret that is, if I am going to do anything that either disrupts their balance or forces them to go somewhere that they don't want to go, like I'm going to hyperextend the joint or something, that's not what we're going to allow. But like I can use it to displace, I can use it to push down, I can use it to push. The only thing that I really am not going to do is either strike them, grab them, or torque them. So placing using a conclusion by grabbing is it's doable. You've got to you've got to make some adjustments to it. You can also in the SCA, a lot of us will also use our offhand weapons, typically a dagger, to place in place of grabbing. So as you step across, you can take your dagger, like your big kind of sail guard, late 17th century dagger, drive it down on top of the strong of their sword, and the fact that and essentially your keons will take the place of grabbing your opponent so that you can control their weapon and then make that.
This is one of the places in SCA fighting that is like weirdly perverse, because you can use the dagger to, you can check the back of somebody's arm with the metal, but not your palm. In some places, it's just a little crazy.
And because of the cross collaboration between the larger WMA community and the SCA subset of it, I think that's starting to change. There is a new rule set that's been under development where body to body contact is going to be more. It's going to be more allowed, and I think that grappling will become something that most anyone can authorize. So we will put you through an authorization. It's called an authorization. What we're looking for in the SCA is, are you a danger to yourself and others? And if the answer is no, great, go out and have fun. If the answer is yes, we're going to keep working.
I'm just going to build on this question, which I think you may have addressed a little bit, but you talked about how you brought in some of the influences of Taekwondo with a focus on offline attacks. I thought that was interesting. What about Krav Maga? Are you bringing in aspects of that, and can you specifically talk about an example?
A little less so. What I learned from Krav that I applied to Destreza and fencing in general is more of a principle than anything else, and that's the human body is only capable of moving in so many different ways, and that as a result, all martial arts systems that use a similar method of inflicting harm are more similar than they are different. So, unarmed, right, punch and kick. How many different ways can you punch and kick someone? Right? You have a straight punch, you have a hook, you have an elbow, you have a jab, you have a cross. They're all kind of this, right? If you look at many different systems, they all use those. And Krav borrows heavily from all kinds from all over the place. When you look at essentially single-handed light swords, how many different ways can we move our arms, right? All of our joints hinge in the same way. And so the thing that I learned from Krav is that your opponent, no matter what look they give you, is a human being and has the same limitations and abilities that you do. And so if you can use what you know to create situations where, that for your opponent that would be disadvantageous for you, they're probably disadvantageous for them too. So I don't particularly care if my opponent is fighting, if it's a diestro, if it's an Italian fencer, if it's fighting silver, or some weird system from any, no matter where are they from. I know that their arms and their hands are capable of moving that weapon in a limited number of scenarios, in a limited number of ways, and putting it into a limited number of ways. And so I don't really care what kind of sword it is or what they're doing. I can put an Tahoe on that no matter what it is. And so fundamentally, that's the thing that Krav taught me, which is that is to look at your opponent as a machine that has a range of motion and constraints, and then take advantage of those constraints. And so in Krav, you want to get to, a lot of times you kind of end up on one side of your opponent, pounding them, and you hit them until they fall down. That's basically Krav. And you want to do that in a way that they can't hit you back as easily. So one of the most common ones is hit them from fear, like be off to the side, constrain, right? You constrain their guard, and then you hit them in the face until they fall. That's a lot like placing in a Tahoe and then stabbing them, except that you use both hands to do it, because it's harder to fight unarmed, to control someone unarmed only using one hand. And that's really the primary. That's like the primary difference. So it really is more strategic. It was more strategic and tactical than like physical.
Jim, I'd like to go back to something you talked about earlier. You said you spent a lot of time working with your students on a Tahoe and breaking a Tahoe and regaining a Tahoe.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit more about some specifics that you do with them and where they see the most success when they're fencing and using these?
Sure. So the most important, the place where I start is once we've learned how to place the Tahoe in all of that checklist, we then move to defending against it. And there are two times and so the first thing that we work on is learning to feel when the Tahoe has started and when the Tahoe has finished. I teach the Tahoe as something you do with your entire body. It starts with your hand, but it is a lowering of the arm combined with a step in order to create that structure. That's the way I teach it. And so I teach students. So we practice recognizing the start of it, and then recognizing what it feels like when it is done, and the structure is ready to strike. The reason for that is that the responses will differ depending on when the student detects what is happening. So, like an example of something, this is a technique that Tom taught us here. That if someone is just, if you're here in your right angle, as the Tahoe is starting, you can, so right as you start to feel that glide, you can step, you can step to the side. Oh, you can step away from the line of their motion of the sword, and just cock your arm back. and it's now no longer, they're no longer touching you, and then you cut them in the face over the, you bring it in over the top of their sword, cut them in the face as you step off to an angle. If you have a shorter, if we're using a shorter, more of a side sword, sword, you may cut them in the arm instead because you don't want to be that close to them.
And you're doing that in the after, like after they've established contact? I'm
doing it in the during. They have started the movement, but they haven't finished it. Right?
Okay, thanks.
So this is not something I've seen in any book or any system. One of the things that I like to do to try and gather information about the kind of fencer my opponent is, right? Hot versus cold, aggressive versus skittish. It's from my right angle. I just do this. I just kind of flick my fingers to see what they do, right? A lot of again, this comes from the SCA. This comes from my SCA experience. We have a lot of Italian fencers who eat leg contact, and so they disengage at the drop of a hat. And so, like, if I can do that, I haven't really lost my right angle. I haven't lost my defense. All I'm doing is moving my finger somewhat. And if they feel that, if my opponent feels that and they freak out and they and they immediately disengage, that tells me all I need to know about what my tile is going to be. Right? It's going to be this. They'll flick of the fingers and then they're going to go that way. They always do. And so what the response that I was just talking about, right? Come out and then come over. That is something you do when right at that first point of contact where the Tahoe is just starting. That's why I say it's more during. By the time you get into, by the time, I think of the after as the Tahoe is there and now they're hitting. And from there, from that scenario, then that's when things are going to look more like conclusions or if we're not comfortable with that, there's not the rule set or the athlete hasn't just gotten comfortable with that yet, then it might be something else like it might be just a disengage back to the right angle with a retreat, but some way of something that is designed to respond to an attack rather than a setup essentially.
So, something else I noticed while you're demonstrating there is that when you're taking a Tahoe, you're keeping your elbow straight the whole time. It looks like. Is that something that you tend to do in all of your Destreza? Keep the arm straight.
It is something that I do because I'm usually the taller person and I'm usually the bigger person.
Okay.
And so and from here I may bend my elbow sometimes, but yeah, mostly I just want to lower my arm because that is for me personally the way I can most effectively use gravity. Not all my students do that, right? Some of my students, if they're built differently, they don't have if they don't have as much upper body strength, sometimes they will bend. Sometimes they will bend the arm to make a ramp. And we talked about that with the height differences, right? That creates a ramp that makes it easier to slide the hilt, the opponent's sword into your hilt. One of my students has pound for pound much more arm strength than I do, and so they're going to look a little different. I do in the SCA, so so we do some grappling here as well. That's not something that I've typically coached. Right now, we don't do it in competition, and so we're really looking at mostly mostly in terms of the conclusion. And so for that, I teach the conclusions as something you do after because they've committed to a thrust and you know exactly where that sword is going now, and so it's easier to get your blade back on it and you kind of roll that around. And that's kind of when I use conclusions. They're almost always a response to an attack that I haven't been able to stop or evade in a different way that's less brave for me basically. Ultimately my overall strategy is be safer, and sometimes that means just not taking risks that you don't have when you don't have to take them. But if if someone is about to stab you, then, you know, a risky or a brave maneuver like the conclusion is better than getting hit. So go for it.
So we're 7 minutes past the hour. I just want to invite the audience to ask some final questions before we go in. And one of the things that has struck me about this lecture, as opposed to some of the other ones, is that you're dealing, you're sort of hearkening back to the original text. The Carranza's text is like a meta text about teaching fencing. And so a lot of the things that you're describing are ideas that Carranza was playing with in this book. How to bring a fencer up to speed, what makes a good fencer, how to teach somebody to fight safely. I think that's really a really good way to approach the tradition. I think it's really interesting.
I think my understanding of Carranza was that that's exactly what he was doing. Was he was teaching what he wanted to do was he wanted to teach young gentlemen, men, how to defend themselves with a sword. And, you know, we're not actually killing anyone, but I'm teaching athletes how to use this system effectively in what passes nowadays for sword combat, with the understanding that this is a sport. We're not actually injuring each other. And so when I look at something, when I evaluate something for its martial soundness, I'm less interested in whether it will kill someone, and I'm more interested in whether or not my athlete can execute it safely, both in terms of risk of injury, and also in terms of is it something that they can use to hit an opponent with a valid scoring blow in a way that respects the tradition of self-defense in lethal combat, as constrained by the safety rules that we all have to operate. So, you know, we're not doing the same thing, but at the end of the day, we're still teaching people how to hit another person with a sharp stick. And so, you know, the outcome may be different, but yeah, I'm more concerned with producing an outcome within the contours of the principles of Destreza than necessarily reproducing exactly, you know, Pacheco says step A to step B to step C to step D, do it this way at this time, because like even if he was alive today, if I was taking class with him, we probably aren't the same size. We probably are not, you know, we probably have different levels of athleticism. And so any teacher is forced to make adaptations for their student if they want their student to come back. I know I think it was Viedma who said that that he never teaches lefties. That doesn't work here. It doesn't work in the modern context, because they will leave. Like if you abuse your students, they won't come back. And you know, we want them to come back. We want to grow this community, and we want everyone to love the system and love this game as much as we do. And so you know, if you take nothing else from me tonight, meet your students where they are, right? You know, check your ego, and focus and try to focus your coaching on making them the best diestro that they can be, even if it isn't necessarily the kind of diestro that you want.
I think that's a nice wrap on the lecture. We haven't had any more questions, so what's left is to just thank you so much for speaking to us tonight and donating your time and your expertise. I
saw the word. I can't pronounce it, but it begins with an A, C, and it ends with a something and an O.
Oh, you're supposed to ask, and give us your take on accametamiento.
I was joking with Doug about this earlier when we went to a dry run of this, and it's the thing that looks like a feint, but it's not a feint, and screw it, the Italians do it better, and they can explain it much more.
Okay, fair enough. I guess that is now tradition, and everyone at this point should have taken a drink. Okay, so thank you so much for your time, and thank you to the audience for coming and joining us. You know, we're in a tough time. It's always nice to get a chance to hang out with everybody. Next week, we're going to have George Zacharopoulos from Greece, and he's going to be speaking to us about a compare and contrast between the Destreza tradition and Italian fencing. So I'm excited to get him here with us. And that's our lecture. Thank you very much, everybody.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Good night.